not contested that the meat industry and the biofuels industry are driving up the price of food so that people are starving to death. And biofuels is exponentially, it's exponentially worse than biofuels.
I guess my main issue here, and I don't really have the information to refute it, at least if I'm going to cite sources, is that I don't really see the huge connection between global food prices and starving to death. Because global food prices are independent of local markets. In agrarian societies, if they're not allowed to develop their local markets and they are simply paying the global food price for these things, then they just can't produce at that efficient a level, and they're not going to grow as a country or an economy.
I wrote an essay for the Huffington Post. If you go to HuffingtonPost.com and you just punch in my name and eating and food crisis, it'll pop right up. It's called Eating as Though the Food Crisis Matters, and it's got links to the World Bank and the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization reports that look specifically at this issue and say exactly what I'm saying is so. And I have yet to see anything from anybody that contests it. And Krugman talks about it pretty regularly in the New York Times, and I've never heard from anybody saying, this isn't right. And the UN Special Envoy on Food continues to rail against biofuels on precisely these grounds. So I think a lot of people would love it if it weren't true. I would love it if animals were not sentient and didn't feel pain. I could go do something else. It would be, a wonderful thing. And similarly, I'd love it if this weren't true, but sadly it is.
Okay, we have quite a few questions. We'll try and get through them.
Okay. I've got 3 points I've been saving. Yep. One is that there are lots of other crops that could be grown by poor countries that would not be dependent on water or resources or pesticides. Bamboo, hemp are just 2 examples. There are others. So it's not like you have to take one industry away and they have no industry. There are others. And my second point was that to support these happy meat farms, that there are still a lot of people that have to go vegetarian or vegan to even get to the point where those would be a viable option, even if I thought it was, which I don't, but that would still have to happen, so it still pushes the argument in that direction. The other thing was, if Bruce could touch on at some point, the death that does happen in the egg and dairy industry. Some people might not know that there is still killing involved there.
I actually had a quick question. Are either of you vegetarian?
I have an addiction.
Vegetarianism or
no. I'll try to stop. I know he's in the ethical right, and it really has persuaded me. Honestly, I watched a couple videos before coming to this debate, and it's literally the presentation in its full extent. It's 45 minutes long. And after watching, I was like, well, damn, I wish I would have known what he was going to talk about before I signed up for this. He's really good.
I was just curious because it seemed like some of your arguments were little when it came to that. But actually, I'm playing devil's advocate here. I think that you make some really good points. Your argument was really smooth, so thank you for coming. But as far as prices go for the global economy and driving up food, you did mention biofuels, which is a huge contributor, and you mentioned land. But the agricultural, farming, corporate farming, I think actually gets more subsidies than the meat industry. And correct me if I'm wrong, I might be. You have a point already.
Most of that meat, or most of that soy that's grown in corn, is Monsanto, and it goes to the meat industry. Okay. So.
Which brings me to my second point, which is GMCs, Monsanto. Actually, you said that a lot of things that are dependent on a lot less water, like super rice or super grain. Actually, a lot of businesses, including Whole Foods, who's the major contributor, corporate contributor against GMCs, or genetically modified crops, if you don't know what that means, which would be exported out to impoverished nations. There are some already, but the fact that there's legislation, because Whole Foods and a lot of corporate organic markets actually provide millions of dollars against legislation that would allow it, because it would kind of go against what they're doing. Because it goes against their idea that genetically modified crops are bad, as opposed to all organic farming. Because a lot of the pesticides, a lot of the GMCs use natural pesticides that are in your food already. They're not necessarily chemicals that I think a lot of people get confused with. And then, I mean, somebody kind of pointed it out when it comes to cruelty. Somebody mentioned that plants have the ability to feel pain, which if you're taking it from that pain is an electrical response in the body, that's true. Like, there's studies that show that like we feel pain, but when it comes down to a cognitive response, like we also doesn't have a brain, so it can't feel pain, and that's kind of like putting it out there. At least as my personal view.
And science.
Yeah. But then you also talked about just the physiological response that chickens and fish feel is the exact same as humans, which is true. That definitely is. But you failed to mention that the cognitive response that humans have more of an interpretation to feel pain, that we remember it, as opposed to fish, which I think almost instantaneously forget it. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily like grounds to eat fish or to eat meat. Like again, I said I'm playing more devil's advocate here.
You're raising a whole bunch of issues.
Yeah.
But so if you want responses to them, you're going to have to go one by one. But I do just want to say the idea that fish or any species forget their pain almost instantaneously is completely belied by the science that's being done by animal behaviorists. And if you just do a Google for fish cognition, there's a tremendous amount of really interesting research. We distilled a lot of it into what we call the hidden lives of fish. So if you want to pull up our hidden lives of fish, it looks at these reports from fish and fisheries about the fact that fish actually have memories that last years, and that they are, as Dawkins says about fish, birds, and mammals, psychologically they've evolved right alongside us. So they may not have the same level cognitive capacities that we do, but they certainly have evolved cognitive capacities. And it makes us feel better to think that they can't remember pain, but they certainly do. I also like what C.S. Lewis said about a lot of things, but the issue of plant pain, he said something along the lines of, if you think that bashing a dog's head in is a moral equivalency with breaking up a head of lettuce, you know nothing of the love of God or the compassion of Christ. So he put it into very Christian terms. But I thought it was a powerful concept. And when, in response to the argument that animals do not have the same psychological response to pain, he said, isn't that an argument that it's worse to cause animals to suffer because they don't know they're going to get away from it ever? It is their entire reality in that moment. So isn't it actually worse? On the issue of animal souls, he said, well, if this is, he said the Bible seems to him to indicate that animals do have souls, but if they don't have souls and this is their only existence, shouldn't we make it as pleasant as possible for them? All of that I thought was pretty strong. And Lewis lost his chair at Oxford over his opposition to vivisection in the end. But.
So just a couple of quick comments.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, so then I was just wondering, because I know that on the PETA website in the blog it says that as far like for giant lobster festivals that they should knock the lobsters unconscious either like with a shock and then boil them or something to the effect, or like when it comes to, you had mentioned how like cows are being, having their testicles ripped off without any kind of like pain reliever. And I'm not saying that that's morally or ethically right to do it without a pain reliever, but just the idea of giving, and this is going to sound kind of weird, and I know it does, but in the sense of, like, you wouldn't want to, like, boost up a whole bunch of antibiotics or pain relievers in a human. Like, would you really want to boost up a huge, like, I mean, this goes with why we shouldn't eat meat. But, like, would you really want to, like, boost up a whole bunch of pain relievers in a cow? Like,
I mean, 2/3 of the antibiotics that we're using in this country are fed to farmed animals prophylactically, right? I mean, we're feeding them to farmed animals because the conditions they're forced to endure would kill them, and so we give them antibiotics so that they can endure those conditions. And consequently, we end up taking massive doses of drugs by eating meat with complete medical establishment opposition to the practice, and yet it continues to go on because these industries are so powerful. So a little bit more so that we don't have to inflict mutilations on animals without their, just try to imagine having a bit of your face lopped off without pain relief. Imagine castration, guys, without any pain relief. If you took your dog or your cat to the vet and said, I want to have him fixed, but I don't want to pay for the pain medications, you and the vet could be charged with felony cruelty, but the pig and the cow don't feel it any less.
But dogs' ears are still mutated to look pointy or lopped off so that they don't have tails.